All right, let's continue our trek through the book of Deuteronomy. Last lesson we looked at the blessings for obedience. Now we come to a little tougher section to go through. The curses for disobedience are explained. And interestingly enough, the curses for disobedience are 4 times larger. This section is 4 times larger than the section on blessings. So this, unfortunately, foreshadows our failure and the curse of the law that we've experienced throughout our history. So let's begin with chapter 28, verse 15. And we begin with the reversal in verse 15, the reversal of the blessings we saw last session. And it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments, his statutes, which I command you this day, all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And now they're listed, verse 16. Cursed shall you be in the city. That's the metropolitan areas. Cursed shall you be in the field. That's the rural areas. So the entire country will be cursed. Verse 17. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading trough. That's the fruits and grains, the agriculture. Verse 18. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body, children, the fruit of your ground, agriculture, the increase of your cattle, herds, the young of your flock, sheep and goats. Verse 19. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. That's your daily activities. So these 6 curses reverse the 6 blessings of verses 3 through 6. So that's the overview. Now we focus in on specifics. We begin in verse 20 with a generic introduction. The Lord will send upon you cursing, discomfiture, that means confusion, consternation, rebuke, that means reprimand, and divine wrath, in all you put your hand unto to do, until you are destroyed, until you perish quickly, until you're ruined. And the reason, because of the evil of your doings, whereby you have forsaken me. So now we come to the first specific curse in verse 21, pestilence. And the Lord will make the pestilence cleave unto you. This is a deadly illness, until he has consumed you from off the land, whither you go in to possess it. Verse 22, consumption. Jehovah, the Lord, will smite you with consumption. Consumption describes a wasting disease that emaciates the body. And the means are with fever, and with inflammation, with fiery heat, and with sword. Now that word sword would be better translated drought, because the word means dryness or heat. He continues, with blasting, that's blight, shriveling the plant. With mildew, that's fungus, destroying the plant. And they shall pursue you until you perish. In verse 23, he turns to drought. Your heaven that is over your head shall be brass. The sky will seem so hard that it can't rain. The earth under you shall be iron. The land is too hard to plow, too dry. Verse 24, the Lord will make the rain on your land. It's not going to be rain, it's not going to be water on your land. The Lord will make the rain on your land powder, sandstorms. There's a picture of a sandstorm sweeping over a Middle Eastern city. The Lord will make the rain on your land dust. And here's a dust storm in downtown Jerusalem. Instead of rain, powder and dust. Second part of verse 24. From heaven shall it come down until you be destroyed. Next we come to defeat and deportation, starting with military defeat in verse 25. The Lord will cause you to be smitten before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them. That's an organized advance. But you shall flee 7 ways from before them. That's a disorganized panic and retreat. And you shall be tossed to and fro among all the kingdoms of the world. So this will be worldwide in scope. Verse 26, the fate of the soldiers. And thy dead body shall be food unto all the birds of the heaven and unto the beasts of the earth. There shall be none to frighten them away. We won't even have time or opportunity for respectful burials. Then physical and mental diseases are promised. Verse 27, the Lord will smite you 4 ailments are brought out with the boils of Egypt. That's a skin disease that's unique to Egypt. Some think it's elephantiasis. That's just a conjecture, however. With emerods, that's hemorrhoids or boils or tumors. With the scurvy, that's scabs, a fungal skin disease. And the itch, another kind of skin disease, whereof you cannot be healed. Verse 29, it continues. 3 elements of emotional and mental illness are brought out. The Lord will smite you with madness. The word means wild, helpless panic. With blindness, that's probably metaphorical, meaning confusion. With astonishment of heart, that means bewilderment, dumbfounded. Verse 29. The results, you shall grope at noonday, lost, confused, disoriented. As the blind grope in darkness, you shall not prosper in your ways. You shall only be oppressed and robbed always, and there will be none to save you. So we'll be utterly defeated, confused, cheated, and helpless. Next, in verse 30, will become the spoils of war. You shall betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. You shall build a house, and you shall not dwell therein. You shall plant a vineyard, and shall not use the fruit thereof. Verse 31, your ox shall be slain before your eyes, and you shall not eat thereof. Your ass shall be violently taken away from before your face, and shall not be restored unto you. Your sheep shall be given to your enemies. You shall have none to save you. Verse 32, your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people. They'll end up in slavery. And your eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all day. So our eyes will run out of tears, but we'll never see our children again. And there shall be nothing in the power of your hand. Helpless. Verse 33. This is scary stuff, isn't it, you guys? The fruit of the ground and all your labor shall a nation which you know not eat up. So a conquering nation will benefit from your agriculture. You shall be only oppressed and crushed always. Verse 34, with the result, so you shall go mad. And the word there literally means insane, irrational, due to grief and suffering. You shall be made mad for the sight of your eyes, which you shall see. So instead of taking the spoils of war, we shall be taken as the spoils of war. Verse 35 continues. We're not done yet. Physical infirmities, personal curses now. And the Lord will smite you in the knees and in the legs with the sore boil, again another skin disease, whereof you cannot be healed, from the sole of your foot unto the crown of your head. So the whole body will be affected. And then in verse 36, deportation comes into view. The Lord will bring you and your king whom you set over you unto a nation you have not known, you nor your fathers. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. Verse 37, our status in exile, and you shall become an astonishment. The word means appalling or shocking. You will be shocking. You will become a proverb. The idea here is a public example and a byword. Now this word means either an object of repeated discussion, did you hear about the Jewish people? Or a taunt, ridicule. And the place among all the peoples whether the Lord shall lead you away. So we'll be dispersed out of the land worldwide. So the blessings are reversed. That's repeated again starting in verse 38. You shall carry much seed out in the field and shall gather little in, for the locust shall consume it. 29. You shall plant vineyards and dress them, but you shall neither drink the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worm shall eat them. Verse 40. You shall have olive trees throughout all your borders, but you shall not anoint yourself with oil, for your olive shall cast its fruit. Verse 41. You shall beget sons and daughters, but they shall not be yours, for they will go into captivity. Verse 42. All your trees and the fruit of your ground shall the locust possess. And on top of this, there's going to be economic woes. Verse 43. The sojourner that is in the midst of you shall mount up above you higher and higher, and you shall come down lower and lower. That's impoverishment. And the results in verse 44, He shall lend to you, you shall not lend to him. Will be in debt. He shall be the head, you shall be the tail. Will be disgraced. The cause is brought out in verse 45. And all these curses shall come upon you, and shall pursue you, and shall overtake you, until you be destroyed. Verse 45, because you hearken not unto the voice of the Lord your God, to keep his commandments, his statutes, which he commanded you. And the result, verse 46, and they shall be upon you as a sign and for a wonder. And the point here is that Israel will become a demonstration of the results of disobedience. Will become an audio-visual example. It'll come upon you and upon your seed forever. Now, this is not that all Israel is cursed for eternity. There's always a faithful remnant. But the unfaithful majority does face this fate, but not the faithful remnant. So these are terms used of the 10 plagues in Egypt, but they're now applied to Israel. And again, verse 47, emphasizing the cause, because you serve not the Lord your God with joyfulness, with gladness of heart, by reason of the abundance of all things. You recall that word joy and rejoice we saw last session over and over again. Well, if we don't serve him with joyfulness and gladness of heart, we're not appreciating his blessings. And so the result is judgment in verse 48. Therefore, you shall serve your enemies that the Lord shall send against you in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, in want of all things. He shall put a yoke of iron around your neck until he have destroyed you. So Israel will serve her conquerors in poverty as a vassal. And it continues. It continues. This doesn't seem to stop. You think we get the idea, but it continues. Verse 49. Military invasion and siege is next. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar. This will be Rome. He's speaking now in the far future. From the end of the earth. You see, this is not true of Assyria or Babylon, who conquered us. These empires were limited to the Middle East, but it is true of Rome. The empire of Rome will conquer on a worldwide basis, according to Daniel 7:23. Rome is the only empire that will go worldwide. So Rome will come from the end of the earth as the eagle flies. A nation whose tongue you shall not understand. Now this also was not true of Assyria or Babylon, because they spoke a cognate language. They spoke a Semitic language. But it is true of Rome. Rome spoke Latin, an Indo-European language. Verse 50, they're described. A nation of fierce countenance. They'll have harsh faces and expressions that shall not regard the person of the old. They'll be brutal, nor show favor to the young. They'll not extend mercy. And I'd like to share here a quote from the Sanchino Chumash by Rabbi Cohen. Rabbi Cohen says, this is a prediction of the attack and invasion of the Romans led by Vespasian and Titus, which ended in the destruction of the temple. And I agree with him. He's got it. And this will become very apparent when we get to verse 64. All right, moving on to verse 51. The land will be depleted by this invading nation. And this nation shall eat the fruit of your cattle, the fruit of your ground, until you be destroyed. So the enemy will devastate the economy. This didn't happen during the first Jewish revolt, but it sure did during the second Jewish revolt. Rome followed a scorched earth policy during the Bar Kokhba revolt. That also shall not leave you grain, nor wine, nor oil, the increase of your cattle, or the young of your flock, till they have caused you to perish. And Judah was devastated during the second Jewish revolt against Rome. The siege of the city is brought out in verse 52. And they shall besiege you in all your gates, until your high and fortified walls come down, wherein you trusted. So there's misplaced trust, right? Trust in stone. Wherein you trusted throughout the land, and they shall besiege you in all your gates throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you. So there'll be no escape. Now here's a couple of slides of the fall of Rome in 70 AD. We entered the outer city here. We continue, Rome continued, entered the inner city there, entered the inner city through the Antonia fortress, and then took the Temple Mount and all the rest of the city. And here's an interesting illustration. I think that's pretty accurate. You can see in the foreground here, the Antonia fortress has been leveled, and Rome made a ramp from the rubble and used that ramp to enter into the temple proper. And you can see the legions of Rome pushing the Jewish defenders back and back and back. All right, verse 53. Now we come to the horror of the siege. You think it's bad already? Here it gets worse, you guys. This is the worst part. Cannibalism of your own family members. The curse of cannibalism. Verse 53. And you shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, which the Lord your God has given you, in the siege and in the distress wherewith your enemies shall distress thee. In verse 54, we have the example of the father, the man that is tender among you and very delicate. So this guy is a gentle and sensitive man normally, but his eye shall be evil. The word means stingy. His eye shall be evil toward his brother, toward the wife of his bosom, toward the remnant of his children whom he has remaining. They're still alive. But in verse 55, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he has nothing left. When? In the siege and in the distress which your enemy shall distress you in all your gates. So here's a father who will not share the body of his own children with his own relatives or even with his wife. Verse 56, the example of a mother. The tender and delicate woman among you, her normal state, who would not adventure to set her foot upon the ground for delicateness. She's pampered. For tenderness, she's indulged. Her eye shall be evil, stingy, toward the husband of her bosom, toward her son, toward her daughter, verse 57, toward her young one that comes out from between her feet, the newborn, toward her children whom she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things secretly. So the newborn and the afterbirth will be eaten secretly to avoid sharing it with the other members of the family. And when? In the siege and in the distress wherewith your enemy shall distress you in your gates. Now there's 3 examples of this happening in the history of Israel. 3 recorded instances of the curse of the covenant. Number 1, the siege of Samaria in 2 Kings 6:29. Number 2, the Babylonian siege of 586 BC, Jeremiah 19:9, Lamentations 4:10, Ezekiel 5:10. And we have an extra biblical account, Josephus, the Wars of the Jews, Book 6, Chapter 3, Paragraph 4, the Roman destruction in 70 AD. So this has come upon Israel at least 3 times in our history. Pretty tough stuff. Now we come to verse 58. And you shall not observe, if you shall not observe, to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear this name, this glorious and fearful name. And the name, so the words glorious and fearful indicate the high status and honor and awesome respect, bordering on terror, that the Lord deserves. The name, the Lord your God. And the results of this violation, again we go into this. Do you think God's trying to tell us something? Are we going to get the point here? Verse 59. Then the Lord will make your plagues wonderful. The word there is Pele. That word is used only of what God does. So these plagues are going to be unique. They're going to be supernatural. So that's not the greatest translation there. We think that it's going to be great, wonderful. But that's not what the word means. And the Lord will make your plagues wonderful, and the plagues of your seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance. Sore sickness of long continuance. I don't know about you, but we've been going through this for the last 2,000 years, haven't we? Verse 60, the diseases of Egypt come back into view. And he will bring upon you again all the diseases of Egypt, which you were afraid of, and they shall cleave unto you. And other diseases as well, in verse 61. Also every sickness, every plague, which is not written in this book of the law. Them will the Lord bring unto you until you be destroyed. And so we'll experience numerical decrease in verse 62. That's the result. And you shall be left few in number, whereas you used to be as the stars of heaven for multitude. Remember that blessing? Because you did not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God. Verse 63, a changed relationship will happen as well. And it shall come to pass, from the positive here, that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, here's the change to the negative, so will the Lord rejoice over you to cause you to perish and to destroy you. So just as God is determined to bless us for obedience, he is equally determined to discipline us for disobedience. And we will be dispersed. Verse 63. And you'll be plucked off the land whither you go in to possess it. And then scattered in verse 64. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. That's why I live in Portland, Oregon. Okay? About as far away from Israel as you can get. Okay? And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. There you shall serve other gods which you have not known, you nor your fathers, even wood and stone. So all this did not happen with the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. That dispersion was confined to the Middle East. This is the only one fulfilled. The requirements here is the Roman conquest that started in 70 AD and was finished up by 135 AD, a worldwide scattering. Now the insecurity in the dispersion comes out in verse 65. And among these nations you will find no ease. Now this was not true of the Babylonian dispersion. We prospered in Babylon. Turned out to be a good place to live. There shall be no rest for the sole of your foot. Well, this was true. This was true of Europe. Constant expulsions from one country to another. The Lord will give you there a trembling heart. That's emotional distress, anxiety. A failing of eyes, that's weeping. A pining of the soul, that's depression. Verse 66. And your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear night and day. You shall have no assurance of your life. In other words, you'll live in constant suspense. Verse 67. In the morning you will say, would it were evening. And in the evening you will say, would it were morning. So we'll live in perpetual dread. For the fear of your heart, which you shall fear. For the sight of your eyes, which you shall see. And we do have extra biblical attestation of this. This is from one of my books called The Legacy of Israel by Bevan and Singer. I always like to quote this portion. So for centuries, the Jew lived in a constant state of alarm and often of acute suffering, never knowing but that he might be driven from his home or see it burnt over his head or be butchered by a mob of ruffians or sent wandering with wife and children to find shelter, if he could, and if not, to die of starvation. There is a book in Hebrew with the significant title of Emek HaBacha, the Valley of Weeping. By the way, it's available on Amazon. It gives in a series of annals the record of all the massacres known to the writer from the earliest times to his own. His own is the middle of the 16th century. Every page of that terrible book is, as it were, soaked in blood and tears. And not the least impressive feature in the recital is the way in which the story of horror is told with a dull monotony in which all separate incidents are merged into one long agony of grief. And we have photographic attestation of this too. There's a pogrom in Minsk, 1936. That's a Jewish building going up in flames. And of course, World War II, Warsaw Ghetto, liberation of Dachau. So the modern expression of all this, we do have records of. Has anything changed today? Anything different today? I don't think so. I don't think so. Till the Messiah comes. All right, let's go on to verse 68. The return to Egypt. And the Lord will bring you into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I said to you, you shall see it no more again. There you shall sell yourselves unto your enemies for bondmen, for bondwomen, but no man shall buy you. So the Jews will be held in the utmost contempt. And again, this was not fulfilled by the Assyrians or the Babylonians, but it was fulfilled by the Romans. Titus took 97,000 Jewish slaves, and 17,000 of them worked as slaves in Egyptian mines. And they were sent there on Roman ships. All right. That brings the suzerain vassal treaty known as Deuteronomy to a close. And now we move into a new covenant. We move into the land covenant in chapter 29, verse 1. So we'll see that this is an additional covenant. And this is a little more pleasant reading. All right, Deuteronomy 29, verse 1. We have an introductory statement. These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. And now notice the distinction. Beside the covenant he made with them at Horeb. All right, here's a map of the area. As the book of Deuteronomy is being written, where are we? We're up in the plains of Moab, right? Where was the Mosaic covenant instituted? Well, there's many places, but I think the traditional place is probably as good as any. The Horeb mountain range. This is where Mount Sinai is located. So, no matter where you think Mount Sinai was, we still have two distinct locations and two distinct covenants. And Moses calls this an additional covenant. So it would be incorrect to speak of it only as a renewal of the one at Sinai. Now this is going to be a contrast between the covenant at Sinai and this covenant, which is a vision of the future of Israel's final restoration. Now the previous message ended with Israel's dispersion. Pretty negative message. This covenant deals with Israel's tenure in the land. It's distinct from the Mosaic covenant, but it is based upon it. Remember, it is administered by the Mosaic covenant. Remember this chart? The Mosaic covenant was a temporary administrator of the Abrahamic covenant. So when you lived in the land under the land covenant, you had to obey the Mosaic covenant until it ceased to be operative. Okay, remember all that? Okay. All right. Now this particular covenant follows the suzerain vassal treaty format as well. It has an historical prologue in verses 2 through 8, some general stipulations in verses 9 through 15, specific stipulations in verses 16 through 19, curses in verses chapter 29, 20 through 30, verse 1, and blessings in chapter 30, verses 2 through 10. Now, this section is often called the Palestinian covenant in commentaries. That's because the land of Israel was renamed Palestine by Emperor Hadrian in 135 BC. It was his way to insult the Jewish people, and the name has stuck. It's been known as that until 1947. Okay? So I call it the land covenant. I don't call it the Palestinian covenant. You will see that in commentaries. All right, let's start with the historical prologue, the historical background in verse 2. And Moses called unto all Israel and said unto them, so this is a brand new segment. He starts talking about the Exodus. You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in, whoops, I've gone too far there. You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, unto Pharaoh, unto all his servants, unto all his land. Verse 3. The great trials which your eyes saw, the signs and the great wonders. Israel's blindness, however, in verse 4, but the Lord has not given you a heart to know, or eyes to see, or ears to hear unto this day. Then his remarks bring forth the wilderness wanderings in verse 5. And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not waxed old upon you. Your shoe has not waxed old upon your foot. So God has supernaturally provided clothing for us in the 40-year wilderness. Verse 6. You have not eaten bread, nor have ye drunk wine or strong drink, that ye may know that I am the Lord your God. The sustenance was water and manna, and it was supernatural. Supernatural water from the rock, for example, and manna every morning. We were supposed to learn a lesson from that. Then we come to the conquest of the east bank in verse 7. And when you came unto this place, Sihon, king of Heshbon, Og, king of Bashan, came out against you unto battle, and we smote them. Verse 8, the settlement. And we took their land, and gave it for an inheritance unto the Reubenites, and to the Gadites, and to the half-tribe of the Manasseites. And in verse 9, the obligation for all this, keep therefore, because of what our suzerain has done for us, because of what God has done for us, keep therefore the words of this covenant to do them, that ye may prosper in all that you do. God desires blessing, not cursing. He desires to prosper us. Now, the recipients of this covenant in verse 10. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God. So this implies some kind of a formal ceremony. And then the participants are listed. Verse 10 still. Your heads, your tribes, your elders, your officers, even all the men of Israel. This is the personal and national leadership. Verse 11. Your little ones, your wives, that's the families. Your sojourner, that is in the midst of your camp. From the hewer of your wood to the drawer of your water. So the idea here is totality. Everybody, right down to the servants, even the most humble servants, stand before the Lord. And the purpose in verse 12, that you may enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, and into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you this day. So this is a distinct and additional covenant. Why? Verse 13, that he may establish you this day unto himself for a people, that he may be unto you a God, as he spoke unto you, as he swore unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. So this covenant is an outgrowth of the Abrahamic covenant. That's why I charted it that way on that chart. And here's the chart. Remember, the land covenant in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 expands and develops the land promise of the Abrahamic covenant. It too is an eternal, unconditional, and unilateral covenant. So it develops the land promise. Now, our attention is turned to a future generation in verse 14. Neither with you only do I make this covenant, this additional covenant, this oath. Now that's a solemn statement, a solemn promise. Neither with you only do I make it, but with two other groups. Verse 15, the first group. But with him that stands here with us this day before the Lord our God. And the second group, and also with him that is not here with us to this day. So that's the future generations, right down to the present. And now we start exploring the idea of covenantal disobedience. Verse 16. For you know how we dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed. And we saw the Gentile idolatry in verse 17. And you have seen their abominations, their idols, wood and stone, gold and silver, which were among them. And then comes the warning, verse 18. Lest there should be among you a man or a woman or a family or a tribe whose heart turn away this day from the Lord our God to go to serve the gods of these nations. Lest there be among you a root that bears gall. That's a poisonous plant, or wormwood. That's a plant known for its bitter pulp. It's not poisonous, but it's very bitter. So those are two pictures of rebellion. Verse 19. And it come to pass when he hears the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart. So here's a rebellious Jewish guy, and he basically thinks he's immune from punishment. He blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace. See, there's that blessing. Though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, to destroy the moist with the dry. The basic idea here is, I won't obey, and there's not going to be any consequences. I'll get away with it. God does not want that to happen. The divine response to a man with that attitude, or anyone with that attitude, the Lord will not pardon him. But then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man, and all the curse that is written in this book shall lie upon him. The Lord will blot out his name from under heaven, verse 21. The Lord will set him apart unto evil out of the tribes of Israel, according to the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law. So again, there will be consequences to pay for those who stubbornly disobey. You see, God is a very patient individual, but he states a red line. And when you cross that red line, judgment comes. Now, an American president may fail to enforce his red lines, but God will not. God will enforce them. So now we come to a prophecy of future generations. Two groups are in view. Verse 22. The first group. And the generation to come, your children that shall rise up after you, the foreigner that shall come from a far land, shall say when they see the plagues of that land, the sicknesses wherewith the Lord had made it sick, verse 23, that the whole land therefore is brimstone and salt and burning, that it is not sown, nor bears, nor any grass grows therein, verse 23, like the overthrow of Sodom, Gomorrah, and Admah, and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. And then in verse 24, the second group, even all the nations shall say, these are the Gentiles, wherefore has the Lord done this to this land? What means the heat of his great anger? What does this all mean? Well, we also have extra-biblical attestation of God doing this to the promised land, and you can read this in Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. He took a trip around the Mediterranean, and so part of his trip was into Israel. And it's a very interesting book. Here's a quote from the book. He says, we traverse some miles of desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. A desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We reached Tabor safely, so that's Mount Tabor. We never saw a human being the whole route. The land's deserted. Question, where are the Palestinians that are supposed to be there from time immemorial? He didn't see any. He didn't see any. Political comments aside, we pressed on toward the goal of our crusade, renowned Jerusalem. The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. No landscape exists that is more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a mournful, dreary, and lifeless. I would not desire to live there. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. That's what he saw. And we have some pictures of that. Here's a picture. This is a colorized black and white taken around the late 1800s when Mark Twain was there. There's Mount Tabor, deserted and desolate. There's Mount Carmel. That's where Haifa is today, deserted and desolate. There's Jerusalem. Not nearly the city that we see today. Here's Mount Tabor today. We're back in the land. Is it deserted and desolate anymore? No way. Here's the Jezreel Valley. Not desolate anymore, is it? Here's Haifa and Jerusalem, thriving city of Jerusalem. The Judean hills, are they desolate anymore? No, we're back, you guys. And Tel Aviv wasn't even there when Mark Twain came by on his little visit. All right, verse 25. Then the men shall say, looking at the desolation, because they forsook the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, verse 26, and went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods they had not known, that he had not given unto them. And the judgment, verse 27, therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, to bring upon it all the curse that is written in this book. Verse 28. And the Lord rooted them out of the land in anger, in wrath, and in great indignation, and cast them into another land, as at this day. Now we have a transitional statement by Moses in verse 29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. That's the future details which are not yet revealed. So this particular comment points toward progressive revelation. That's God's revelation unfolds over time. But the things that are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever. And an example of this follows in the next chapter, chapter 30. And we're at chapter 30 right now in the restoration of Israel, in chapter 30, verse 1. And we'll see here the national repentance of Israel. Verse 1. It shall come to pass, when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So after a worldwide dispersion comes a national salvation and fulfillment in the kingdom. Now, nice quote from the Soncino commentary by Rabbi Cohen. He says, the whole of this section refers to the distant future. None of its predictions has so far been fulfilled. And he's right on there. You know, when you look into rabbinics, you guys, be very careful. Look at rabbinics very analytically, because as you go through the rabbinic writings, you're going to have to mine away a lot of coal. But there are gems there. So it's worth it. You got a lot of coal you got to get rid of, but there are diamonds amidst the coal. All right, and this is a good one. He understands what's going on here. Verse 2, the regeneration of Israel. And shall return unto the Lord your God, that's repentance, and obey his voice according to all I command you this day, you, your children, and then comes the inner attitude, a thorough and sincere change, with all your heart and with all your soul. So all Israel in Romans 11, 25 through 27, that refers to every living Jewish man and woman and child at the end of the tribulation period. That will be 1/3 of the worldwide Jewish population. Every living Jewish man, woman, and child will place their faith in Yeshua at that time. That's what Romans 11, 25 through 7 is talking about. For I would not, brethren, have you ignorant of this mystery, lest ye be wise in your own conceits, that a hardening in part has befallen Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel shall be saved. Even as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, he shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them, when I shall take away their sins. So this hasn't happened yet. That's what we're working for in Jewish outreach. And then the second coming comes into view, that then the Lord your God will turn your captivity, will have compassion upon you, and return. So God will return. Where's he going to return from? From heaven. And Israel will return. From where? From dispersion. And so now we see the regathering of Israel. He will gather you from all the peoples whither the Lord your God has scattered you. So this is a worldwide physical regathering of living Israel. And verse 4, if any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord your God gather you. From thence will he fetch you. And so this talks about a regathering from heaven. And this is a reference to resurrected Israel. These are the Old Testament believers are resurrected for entrance into the kingdom. And in verse 5, there'll be a possession of the land. And the Lord God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will do you good. and multiply you above your fathers. So at this time, Israel will possess all of the promised land permanently. Verse 6, the regeneration of Israel is in view. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart. This is Old Testament regeneration terminology. And in the New Testament, we have Romans 2, 25 through 29, which is an example of this terminology. So he will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed. These are future generations who will believe in Yeshua. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And this is eternal life. But there will be judgment on the enemies of Israel in verse 7. And the Lord your God will put these curses upon your enemies, on them that hate you, that persecute you. So this is curse for curse in kind. This is a principle of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12:3 and Galatians 6:7. I will curse those that curse you and bless those that bless you. And Galatians 6:7, you reap what you sow. And then in verse 8, we get a glimpse of millennial blessings, the salvation of Israel. And you shall return and obey the voice of the Lord and do all his commandments, which I command you this day. And then there'll be material blessings in verse 9. The Lord your God will make you plenteous, that's prosperous, in all the work of your hand, that's your daily work, in the fruit of your body, that's your family, in the fruit of your cattle, your herds, in the fruit of your ground, your agriculture. And the Lord will rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers. And the condition of Israel in verse 10, if you shall obey, a better translation there would be, when you shall obey the voice of the Lord your God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law. And again, when rather than if, when you turn unto the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Now at this point, I'd like to share a little bit of a timeline with you. So maybe you can see how these curses of the covenant all work out. I hope this graphic makes things clear and doesn't confuse anybody. So there's our timeline from left to right. Now we start with the book of Judges through the Assyrian invasions. During that time in our history, we suffered sickness, harassment, insecurity, drought, famine, and wild animals. These are curses of the covenant. This is discipline, believe it or not, of mild intensity. All right, let's move down our timeline. Now, during the Assyrian and Babylonian invasion, we suffered the horrors of siege. This is discipline of increasing intensity. You know, God says, if you still don't obey me, I will discipline you 7 times more. All right, moving down our timeline. During the Babylonian and Roman destructions, we suffered devastation, deportation, dispersion. Again, discipline of increasing intensity. Let's move down our timeline. After the Babylonian and Roman destructions, the state of the land was resting and desolate. That was for 70 years after Babylon and for 2,000 years after Rome, which we just read about with Mark Twain. After the Roman destruction, not the Babylonian destruction, remember, we prospered in Babylon. But after the Roman destruction, the state of the people is described, fearful, weak, dispersed, and persecuted. And we read about that in a book by Bevan and Singer. Then comes the first worldwide regathering. That was 1839 to 1947. And that led to the reestablishment of the state of Israel. But you know, we're still suffering harassment by surrounding enemies. We haven't received the blessings of the covenant in full, have we? No. What we see in Israel today is just a taste of the good things to come. We're still harassed by our surrounding enemies. Let's move down our timeline. Then finally, this is what chapter 30 is talking about. There'll be a final restoration. We'll experience peace and an end to suffering. That's the blessings of the Messianic kingdom after a second worldwide regathering. Isaiah 11:11 talks about that second worldwide regathering. Now you notice I have a blank spot there. Something's missing in my timeline. All right, I'll add in what's missing there. That's the Antichrist destruction, the tribulation diaspora. This will be the most severe discipline we've ever experienced. 2/3 of the worldwide Jewish community will be killed during the tribulation diaspora. This is why I'm in Jewish work. Being in Jewish work, we can snatch the remnant from the jaws of hell and from the jaws of the tribulation. All right, now let's take a look at the importance of the land covenant. First of all, it reaffirms Israel's title deed to the land. Under the Abrahamic covenant, remember this principle? We've talked about this in both classes. Ownership of the land is unconditional. But under the Mosaic covenant, if Israel is disobedient, she will be exiled from the land. So Israel's disobedience under the Mosaic covenant does not render her ownership of the land null and void. The land covenant affirms now that the enjoyment of the land is conditional, however, ownership of the land is unconditional, in spite of unbelief and disobedience. All right, let's go on to verse 11. There's a call to choose life. For this commandment which I command you this day is not too hard for you. It's not incomprehensible. There's no special interpretations required to understand it or to obey it. Neither is it far off. It's not inaccessible. It's all written down. Verse 12, it's not in heaven that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven to bring it unto us and to make us hear it, that we may do it. So there's no need to send a messenger to heaven to inquire of God's covenant expectations. It's written right before us. Verse 13. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us to bring it unto us and make us hearers that we may do it. So there's no need to send messengers to a distant land to hear God's revelation. Verse 14, it's near. But the word is very near unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. Just use the old Nike comment, just do it. Now this is quoted in Romans 10, 6 through 8. This is a literal prophecy plus an application. He's applying this. Okay? But the righteousness which is of faith saith thus, say not in your heart, who shall ascend into heaven, that is to bring Messiah down, or who shall ascend into the abyss, that is to bring Messiah up from the dead. But what saith it? The word is near unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, that is the word of faith which we preach. So Messiah fulfilled the law and kept it perfectly. There's no need to go to heaven or hell to fetch him or to go overseas. He's near through faith. So in verse 15, there's a call for a decision. There are two paths. See, I have set before you this day. Now the focus is no longer on the future, but back on the present generation about to enter the land. They must now make a personal choice. And there's two options. Positive side of the coin, in verse 15, I have set before you this day life and good. That's physical life and the enjoyment of life. This is the blessings of the covenant. And the negative side of the coin, death and evil. This is physical death and calamity, the curses of the covenant, destruction and expulsion. Verse 16, in that I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, his ordinances. Verse 16, that you may live and multiply, that the Lord your God may bless you in the land whither you go in to possess. See, that's God's heart. He wants to bless us. Verse 17, but if your heart turn away, and you will not hear, but shall be drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I denounce you this day, verse 18, I denounce you unto this day. You shall not prolong your days in the land whither you shall pass over the Jordan to go in to possess it. And then he calls the witnesses of the covenant forward. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life, that you may live, you and your seed. And the means of choosing life, to love the Lord your God, to obey his voice, and to cleave unto him. To cleave unto him means to hold fast to him, to abide in him. And the reasons for went too far there. The reason for he is your life and the length of your days. He controls your present and your future, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. And again, this covenant is associated with the Abrahamic covenant, not the Mosaic covenant. All right, at this point we come to the fifth main division in your outline. We come now to a dynastic transition section. So the covenant moves from Moses to Joshua at this point. Chapter 31, verse 1. And Moses went and spoke these words unto all Israel, verse 2. And he said unto them, I am 120 years old this day. In Genesis 6:3, 120 years is the maximum allotted for mankind. His weakness, I can no more go in and come out. He can't, it's a strain to do his daily leadership activities. He feels some kind of a change coming on in his body. His physical stamina is reducing. The Lord has said unto me, you shall not go over the Jordan. And in verse 3, the two leaders of the conquest are mentioned. First, the Lord your God, He will go over before you. That's the divine leader. He will destroy those nations from before you. You shall dispossess them. The second is, the second leader is Joshua. Joshua, he shall go over before you, as the Lord has spoken. There's the human leader. And then there's a promise of victory. And the Lord will do unto them as He did unto Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and unto their land whom He destroyed. Verse 5. The Lord will deliver them up before you. You shall do unto them according to all the commandment which I have commanded you. Verse 6, the exhortation, positively, be strong and of good courage. Negatively, fear not, nor be affrighted of them. For the Lord your God, it is He who does go with you. He will not fail you, nor forsake you. As we get to verse 7, we come to the charge to Joshua. And Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and of good courage. Joshua's role in the second part of the verse. For you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn unto their fathers to give them. That's a description of the task ahead. And you shall cause them to inherit it. Verse 8, and the Lord, He is it who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you, neither forsake you. Fear not, neither be dismayed. Now in verse 9, the writing and the delivery of the text. And Moses wrote this law, the book of Deuteronomy here, and delivered it unto the priests, the sons of Levi, that bear the covenant of the Lord unto the elders of Israel. And he gave them a charge in verse 10. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time of the year of release, that's the sabbatical year, in the Feast of Tabernacles, verse 11, when all Israel is come to appear before the Lord your God, this is the pilgrim festival, in the place which ye shall choose, and that, of course, is Jerusalem eventually, you shall read this law before all the people in their hearing. Verse 12, assemble the people, the men, the women, the little ones, that's the entire households, the sojourner that is within your gates, that's the Gentiles, that they may hear and that they may learn and fear the Lord your God and observe all the words of this law. Verse 13, that their children who have not known may hear and learn and fear the Lord their God as long as you live in the land whither you go over the Jordan to possess it. So even the Gentile sojourners were required to hear and learn and obey the law. They were living in the land, they had to obey the laws of the land. So this section stresses the importance of the public reading of the text. It was impossible then for everyone to possess a copy of the Scriptures. And it was critical that all Israel hear. So the good time to do it was the pilgrimage at the central sanctuary. And the emphasis is doing carefully. That's mentioned 10 times. Responsible obedience is stressed. All right, I am a couple minutes over, and so we will take our 30-minute break, and then we'll pick it up in 30 minutes with chapter 31, verse 14, and the commandment to write a song. So go ahead and take your break.